So I'm back with another map scouting success story here. This comes from a little bit different terrain than what um, I'm normally putting out, which is like the steep hill country, mountainous, hollows and hills type of terrain. This is more of your conventional Midwestern rolling hills, agricultural, farmland, pasture land, kind of habitat and terrain. So, again, this is a success story, kind of like the last one was, where this hunter had kind of chased this buck for a couple of years, reached out to me. We bounced ideas off of each other, um, going back during the summer, all the way up until early season. Kind of broke it down, kind of walked him through what I was looking at. He videos me back some of his scouting missions that he'd kind of went out on, scouting trips in that area. Helped him drop some cameras, where to place them, things like that. He had missed this deer 2 years ago. It was like a 3.5-year-old 8 point, and he eventually caught up with the buck this past year in late October and sealed the deal. And we're going to kind of break down what he'd done originally, and then kind of what he done um, to kind of get the deal closed and end up harvesting this buck. So to begin with, I'm going to give you an overview of how all of the terrain and habitat kind of laid out. So as you're looking at the property, this is around 175 to 180 acres that he had access to, and that's pretty much what's in the frame right here. If you look to the south toward the bottom of the screen, you'll see the two green and yellow blobs there, and those represent soybeans in the green and corn in the yellow, and that was our main food source on the property as far as what he had access to. So that was kind of the generating point for movement as we rotated from early season, late summer, and then through the fall period that he was hunting this property. Those are right around 15 to 18, 20 acres or so, both those fields together, and pretty much all movement was generated basically off of them, as far as like does and younger bucks and even the older bucks that were kind of cruising through the area. They were all kind of utilizing those fields because everything around it was pretty much pasture land. The next closest food source was several miles away, some other kind of cropland. Um, if you see the kind of brown shading within those draws and drainages in there, that was just super thick cover. High stem count, saplings, brush, multiflora rose. I mean, you name it, it had everything. It was super thick. It was the kind of thick stuff that you really couldn't see through. You really didn't want to walk through. It was just super thick, and it maintained that thickness pretty much year round. It may have died off during, once we had a frost and a freeze, but it was still just super high stem count and was really hard to penetrate it. So that's kind of what we're dealing with right there. Really good bedding all up through that. That kind of brown shading stuff was just super thick and had concentrations of sign and just, that your trails and all were just piling in and out of that area. And kind of around it on the ridge points were a lot of the oaks. So you had a kind of an oak hickory mix in this area, I think is what we determined. So soft mass on the ridges and then super thick down in those drainages. So that's basically what the hunter was dealing with when he was in here. And so now we're going to kind of dive in, show you a little bit more of what he found in those areas. So to start out, as far as access goes, the hunter could access this property from the south, basically from like where the soybean fields are, and he could also access it from the northwest. So that was the two main access points were the southeast corner and the northwest corner of this property. So before we dive too far in to kind of breaking things down on what he was doing and things like that, and what eventually led to harvesting it, his access points were from the southeast through the soybean field and from the northwest via access road that he had to walk in on. So those were the access directions. So the previous 2 years that Hunter had been in here, he'd always accessed from the soybean fields. This is basically where he had put all of his energy into, was this two drainages and a saddle that was kind of north of those soybean fields, and he was trying to catch the buck, uh, coming from what he thought was a bedding area to the north, and catch them coming to those soybean fields in the early season. He felt like that was his best chance, and he really couldn't hunt this property after mid-October, so he didn't have access to it then, and so he had a limited time, so he was just trying to capitalize on what he could. So he was basically trying to access from the south and work up those ridges, and he was doing it almost with a southwesterly, westerly kind of wind, and that's what he was utilizing to get in there. And so he was getting blown out a lot, mainly because he was walking in and the wind was almost, moving with him or just across his face. And so he was getting blown out a lot. So in October 23, he's hunting in there, and he has an encounter with the buck he's after. Buck's coming out of the kind of northeast of where he's located, where that black stand side is, and he thinks the buck got his scent. Buck got real nervous, and he ended up missing the buck. So he goes back in there a couple days later, and he ends up getting blown out again before he got to the stand location. And it's kind of a domino effect. Once those deer blow out, he hears everything blowing north of him. He's discouraged. He leaves the area, and he basically doesn't hunt there anymore. So he reached out to me at the end of the 23-24 season, just to kind of bounce ideas off of each other. And he needed some help. And so my first question is, what drew you to this area? What made you hunt and pick this location to kind of hunt? And what I learned is everything that caught his attention was in those the heads of those drainages where all these pins are for rubs. There was just an insane amount of buck sign in here, both historical and fresh, as he went in there and scouted during the season, covered in scrapes, covered in rubs, big rubs, everything. So it was like a blinking light. It was just drawing him to it. And so, along with trying to set up on that pathway to those soybean fields, he was hunting the edges of where the thick cover was and where it broke out into the open hardwoods. He was focused more on the open hardwoods, thinking those bucks would come out and feed him those acorns. So we really needed to do some postseason scouting, and I wanted him to find where he was getting blown at. What location was it coming from? It's kind of boogering everything up. So it's that blue pin, the doe bedding. It was a CRP field that butted up against the private property. It was covered in beds, just clusters of beds. And so when he was walking through there with that southwest wind, they were catching that scent, and they were hightailing it to the northwest and basically running everything out that he was trying to work his way into to hunt. So it was kind of defeating him before he ever got in there. That's why he kept getting blown at. So what we decided was to no longer hunt in this area, but to utilize this area for intel gathering. So no more hunting because it was just too risky. So we're going to use it to gather intel. So we decided to hang a couple cameras. One camera was hung right on the edge of the high stem count, thick area where it met that saddle to the north. There's a big scrape there, big rubs all around it, couple trails crossing right there, and that was where he missed the buck originally. We hung a camera right there. We followed that rub line, big tracks in the mud, kind of crept around a a topographical line that went around there. It kind of followed it, and it went into a point between the cornfield and the soybean field that was kind of low. We hung another camera right in there about 50 yards off the fields in that little drainage. There was a lot of rubs right in there, a lot of big tracks, couple scrapes. We hung another one right there and hoped that we would get the buck on both of them, and that way we could have a good idea of timing when he was utilizing either the soybean field or the cornfield once it was cut. So now then we got to figure out what can we do to kill this buck on this property, and I figured that our best chance is going to be the west side of this property. Everything that lays outside of the screen here you see to the west was mostly other private ground. It was mostly pasture land, had cattle on it, dairy cows, things like that. So it was really open. There wasn't a whole lot of wooded areas or anything that offered any cover. So I thought we had this buck kind of pinched into this really tight area right here, utilizing these soybean and corn fields as a good food source, and all of this high stem count stuff in these thick drainages as a good kind of bedding security cover area. So I had a good idea that this guy was going to be able to get in there and utilize this westerly side to harvest this buck. So now we started focusing on this north and westerly section of the property, and during postseason scouting, gained a lot of intel. He found a couple of other doe bedding locations, clusters of beds really close together, that were to the northwest of the cornfield and the soybean field, just on kind of secondary ridge points above that thermal hub. One thing he noticed immediately in postseason scouting was the direction of the rubs. On the east side of the property where he had been hunting, the rubs all led into that soybean and cornfield. So on that side of the property, everything was matriculating from the north to the south. Once he crossed over to the west side, everything had a westerly to northwesterly to north component to it. So all the rubs were kind of facing northwest to north. I knew that since everything to the west of this property was kind of pasture, that buck was pinned in right there. So any kind of westerly movement would eventually turn north or northwesterly. So we had a good secondary ridge point right here that had a scrape on it in a small saddle, just a micro saddle that had a drainage coming up to it. All that was thick on that southeast side, but to the northwest side was just pretty and lush. It was open, just looked like a park area, but right on that crest was really super thick, and then it broke over into the pretty woods. And right on that crest was a scrape, heavily used scrape right there with a big rub. We dropped the camera right there. We immediately went down that drainage, micro drainage, into that larger drainage and hung a camera at the base of that. And then we just waited and hoped we could get that buck in postseason, still utilizing kind of back to his old non-rut travel pattern. Also during postseason scouting, he was able to go in there and locate a few of what we assume are this buck's primary bedding areas or bedding locations. They were up in the main drainage, up at the head of that drainage where the thicker cover broke off into kind of some steeper terrain. Again, it's kind of rolling hills here, but that thick cover, when it tucked up into that steeper area, found several good beds with faint trails and big sign leading up to them. So felt pretty confident that was going to be a really good generalized bedding area for this buck. So after postseason scouting and all the summer work, all the summer scouting, all the trail camera pictures, we kind of looked at things from a 30,000 foot view, and it was pretty obvious, putting everything together, that outside of the rut, this buck had a pretty well-established bed to feed to bed circuit that he was utilizing at least part of the time in this area, in this little 170, 180 acres. He was utilizing it a good bit. So now it was just about finding the right location, the right conditions, the right timing, um, just basically putting yourself in an intercept point, an ambush point that's the least risk, highest reward possible, instead of trying to force the way you want to harvest the deer upon the deer. It's just putting yourself in a better position. So I feel like this deer was probably utilizing, like a lot of older bucks do, not only are you trying to defeat their ears and their eyes and their nose, but they're normally putting other deterrents between you and them or between them and danger. So this buck had tons of eyes and ears and noses between him and his weak point, which was the feeding area, the area he was seeking out. So it probably didn't take that buck very long to figure out that's where the dangers lie. And, I'm going to position myself where anything that comes through here has got to go through a gauntlet to get to me. So um, that's just one of those benefits that older bucks have and they utilize. So now, where is his weak point and where does he not have all those eyes, noses, and ears on him, and you can harvest him without having to walk a minefield, basically. So this ended up being the location he chose to hunt this buck at, and it ended up being the location he killed it at. It took 3 sits there for him to eventually connect, but it eventually paid off. He really resisted the urge to sit on that scrape location. It was a really good looking location, but he had never gotten that buck on camera at that scrape during daylight. It had always been about 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour before daylight, that he would come by that scrape. So there was really no intel that said that buck was utilizing that scrape during daylight. I'm pretty sure that buck was just kind of hanging out around that area, scent checking it. So the buck was actually coming up another micro drainage out of the bottom of that main drainage or the main hub when he unalived the buck. Um, Pretty sure that buck was about to hook back into its bedding area. We had a northeasterly wind. I think he said it was pretty light. So he was riding a fine line, but he had thermals where he sat at. He was sitting on the opposite side of the ridge from where the buck came up at. So right where he was at, all of his thermals were piling down into that little micro hub below him, and that would all dump out into the pasture to his west. So he was pretty good right there, as long as his wind didn't creep up too high to kind of override those thermals. He would have been good there. So this is one of those cases where um, getting in the right position with the right wind and the right thermals, not having too strong of a wind to overpower those thermals. I talked about having a wind the last time that would override the thermals and get yourself in a position. Well, this was just the opposite. If he'd have been there with a little stronger wind, um, he would have probably been in a real dangerous location and probably got blown out. The key here was he put himself in a position where all of his scent would have went into that pretty hardwood, all those thermals pulling into that pasture. That's where all of his scent would have went. So there was a low likelihood that buck or any deer would have traveled through there, and his access was from a totally different direction, come in from the northwest and walk straight into his stand location, and didn't put any of his scent in the path of where that buck or other deer would go through. So it was a top notch, well thought out couple of sits that he put in here, and then eventually that buck hit its circuit and he was there to capitalize. It was conditions, position, and patience that paid off here, and it led to another success story. I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you got something out of this, and we will see you next time.